All right, welcome to today's webinar, A Risk-Based Approach to SaaS Security. My name is John Phillips. For those of you that don't know who we are, AppOmni is the leading SaaS security platform, providing protection for in excess of 40 of the most commonly used SaaS apps in the enterprise. In the next 30 or so minutes, we'll explore the importance of developing a risk-based approach to SaaS security. I've got an exciting panel lined up for today's discussion. We have Alec Pfeiffer, Senior Director of Product Management at AppOmni. Alec, please introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, like John said, my name is Alec Pfeiffer and I lead our labs team here doing research at AppOmni, as well as a few of our product teams. I've got a little over a decade in the security industry and have been with AppOmni for the last 2 years. Very excited for today's conversation.
Thank you, Alec. We also have Aaron Costello, Principal SaaS Security Engineer at AppOmni. Aaron, please introduce yourself.
Hey folks, I'm Aaron. I work on the labs team, one of the founding members. So that is our security research and threat intel function here at AppOmni. I'm also responsible for building some of the applications that are integrated with most beloved SaaS systems today. I will be walking you through our risk-based approach to SaaS security.
Yeah, Aaron's being really humble. He does extensive and phenomenal work in the SaaS security space. You should really, I encourage you to follow his work and to check out the work that the AO Labs team is doing. Gentlemen, for today, this stat that we've got up on the screen from the FBI, this was released a few weeks back or about a month or so back by the FBI. And it's not surprising, although maybe the extent is quite surprising, that financial damages associated with cybercrime are up a staggering 49% year over year. Alec, a question for you. If we look at these stats, we could look at the FBI stats, we could look at IBM cost of a data breach. Every year, the costs associated with cybercrime are increasing. Why is this the case?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's one that's often asked because it feels like security is just an insurmountable problem. I think really it gets down to the heart of it and being attackers of business. Success begets success, and attackers have been very, very successful. It's a very lucrative industry in many parts of the world. Sometimes it's the best way to make money for somebody who's a bit technically minded. And the risk is relatively low compared to the rewards that they can reap. So if actions that companies and governments take make an attacker's job a bit more risky, I would say this is more than offset by the revenue that they're seeing and makes the risk worth the reward. Additionally, I think that just the number of additional services and data coming online means that attackers always have a fresh target to look at. The military uses terms like hard target and soft target to describe the general security posture of a target. A soft target being something that's easily accessible and exploitable, whereas a hard target is relatively more obscure, secure, and therefore harder to attack. And there's just an astounding number of these new services and data coming online every day, and the vast, vast majority of them are very soft targets. Oftentimes, what makes these targets soft is because of self-inflicted issues, not basic things like not knowing your assets, not knowing where your data is at, who has access to what, and other generally misconfiguration-based risks.
Yeah, I love that, Alec. I think that you're underscoring the importance that a lot of the basics are not being implemented in across the attack surface, and also as the attack surface has also obviously expanded in scope and scale. It becomes increasingly difficult for organizations to stay on top of maintaining a proactive and a resilient cybersecurity posture. Aaron, a question for you. If we look at this from your lens as a SaaS security engineer, why are we seeing just in the last few months, and we've got this phenomenal tracker on our website that shows you the SaaS attacks as they happen. We're seeing an increasing number of SaaS companies and SaaS service providers being targeted. Why is this the case?
Right. Well, I don't think there's any denying the power of SaaS applications today, right? And the kind of vast array of services that they just provide out of the box to customers of any particular size, right? And these systems not only house information like PII, right? It can be your most sensitive data. So we're talking PHI for healthcare. In the case of ERP SaaS, we're also talking about financial data as well, right? But personally, I think the largest playing factor in the uptake of malicious activity from threat actors is the ease of interoperability between these systems, right? So customers have taken advantage of this functionality to make their lives a lot easier. It's no longer a case, if we look at standard web application type of attacks, where a threat actor would maybe compromise a single host, right? Its own dedicated server, maybe with its own dedicated backend database, and then trying to escalate privileges or root it, as you'd say. But through these SaaS systems and their interoperability with other SaaS systems, they're no longer restricted necessarily to one specific host and one specific type of data, right? So that will naturally depend on the initial foothold that these threat actors get, their kind of privileged context. However, it is in the case of SaaS systems that there's a very, very, very large risk in being able to pivot. I think that's what kind of makes SaaS so unique in that, because of that interoperability.
That's really interesting. I think you're just touching on the point of multiple attack vectors, multiple entry points, and just the sprawling nature of SaaS. It's a nice ending note that tees up our next data point, where our CEO often refers to SaaS as the new enterprise operating system, this SaaS mesh becoming all-encompassing, touching every aspect of the way businesses are running. So let's get into that next data point that we have. This is taken from Gartner, and I know there's a link for a research paper that we put out, a white paper, a risk-based approach to SaaS security, the title of this webinar that you can download. That just shows the prolific nature of SaaS growth over the last 5 years, and really going back even further, back to 2016, we've seen SaaS and SaaS-related services being the leading driver of public cloud adoption and public cloud-related services. But Alec, if we look at SaaS and SaaS security, for instance, it doesn't compare well to cloud infrastructure security. If you look at cloud infrastructure and the security tools that are associated with that, they've kind of walked in, maybe not quite in lockstep, but much more aligned as cloud infrastructure growth has grown. We're only now starting to see SaaS security being prioritized with tools like AppOmni. What in your view explains this phenomenon?
Yeah, no, I think it's another good question. I think there's a lot of reasons behind it. Not to just focus on the basics, but that's where I like to start out first. I think fundamentally it comes down to a misunderstanding of the shared responsibility model specific to SaaS. So what's the customer's role within securing their own use of the SaaS application? Because I think in general, you hear SaaS, a lot of folks think, hey, you're outsourcing this operations and security. It's a major selling point for us to migrate to SaaS. And I think this outsourcing mentality creates a bit of complacency that then bleeds over to just kind of not being quite sure of what indeed they're responsible for. So a perspective I frequently hear is, we pay Salesforce, we pay Workday, whomever, very good money. They better be secure. And to me, this really illustrates the misunderstanding of that shared responsibility model of kind of overlapping it with app security or security of the underlying infrastructure. That on the SaaS application, that can be rock solid, right? We can just for the sake of theory say that there is zero holes in that. There aren't, obviously, but for the sake of illustration, many teams still aren't aware, or at least don't fully appreciate, the wildly common and potentially critical risks that are possible with their own misconfiguration of that tool. Things that they are directly responsible for, but necessarily aren't always front and center when you're talking about the shared responsibility model. And I think overall, to your point, John, about SaaS security lagging behind public cloud infrastructure security, it really creates this inverted risk model that exists within SaaS. Infrastructure IaaS is well understood now. CSPM vendors like Wiz have just done an amazing job addressing this space. They've got a ton of traction. Major enterprises everywhere are using them. But security spend in IaaS is roughly, let's say, 6.6% or so. I think that was the last report that Gartner came out with. But when we look at SaaS, the spend is often, total SaaS spend is often equal to or even greater than IaaS spend, whereas there's still little attention, let alone little budget paid towards SaaS. So I think it's just a matter of the industry coming to terms with the responsibilities that they have within the shared responsibility model for SaaS, because it's a bit more subtle compared to IaaS. But that shift is occurring. It's just going to take some time.
Yeah, I really like what my takeaway from what you've just said is that we need to do there's a lot of education required to really educate users of SaaS, which is basically every enterprise, on that shared responsibility model and the responsibility that comes with that you can't just outsource. And we can relate that even to our personal lives, where we have this At least I'm starting to really take much more proactive action on my SaaS app security that I use. But this belief of this implicit trust that you kind of, it's the sole responsibility of the vendor. We know that was very true with the early days of cloud adoption, that people thought, yeah, I'm going into the cloud, I don't have any of those data center risks anymore, and that they quickly had that learning curve. Aaron, do you have anything to add from your perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I touched on a great point there. We look at CSPMs and stuff like that. And if you look at cloud security engineer jobs being posted on LinkedIn or otherwise for these cloud security roles, so not SaaS security, they often are a single cloud provider shop, right? They want you to have experience in one of the big three, like GCP, Amazon, whatever it might be, right? So you have a very honed focus. It's a very, very large ecosystem, but it is somewhat more honed focus. When we look at SaaS and SaaS security, and maybe what would it mean to be a SaaS security engineer with the shared responsibility model, that model can, I guess, surface itself in different ways depending on the products, depending on the SaaS products that you're using, and what exactly you're being asked to be responsible for, right? Because unlike these cloud providers, organizations are using a very wide array of SaaS products, depending on what they need to fit their kind of business use case and what's needed, whether it's HR management, payroll, ERP, whatever it might be. And I think that's the very unique challenge with this shared responsibility model, is helping organizations understand, well, how does that surface in these different applications, right? It's a very unique challenge. I do think it's lagging a little bit behind as a result of that. It's a very momentous task for a SaaS security engineer to kind of take on, but it is a typical kind of jack of all trades, right? You need to have a good knowledge of each product in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant point you've underscored, and we'll get to that in the next data point that we have, the next slide that we have. Just the complexity, the diversity of SaaS applications used in the enterprise. We know that it can exceed 100, upwards of 500, depending on the size of the organization, and that doesn't even include the custom applications developed in-house. And just a little plug there, Omni has our developer platform where we can also provide security for your custom applications as well. But that complexity, I think, underscores the key differentiation from the conventional, well, let's call it the infrastructure-focused tooling, and the need for that granularity to address numerous divergent SaaS applications and the various security settings that come with that. And that tees up our next data point to our slide. It's got a couple of data points on there. And Alec, if you just take us through, if we just pivot off that last point that Aaron made, let's just take us through like why some of the legacy approaches, like cloud access security brokers, are no longer, or they're effective, but maybe not as effective as a dedicated SaaS security tool like App Omni to protect your SaaS apps, and including those SaaS to SaaS connections.
Yeah, I mean, just at a start, like the name implies it, right? CASBs are brokers that access the cloud. They focus on that secure perimeter, protecting the internal resources from those external threats. They may have worked a decade ago when networks were a bit more centralized, but modern networks with the prolific use of SaaS applications, they're highly decentralized. There's just incalculable number of access points. Your data isn't stored within a nice perimeter. It's stored often within the actual cloud provider. It doesn't even account for your own use or configuration of the underlying application, the SaaS application that is. So it's a dated model, right? It has time. Its time is no longer. I mean, you can see this. It's fairly widely known even by the major CASB vendors who are looking to get into the SSPM space with their own offerings. I mean, the industry, the vendors, they recognize that the tools fall short. So there's a need to update that model. And security, the threat landscape evolves, networks evolve, tools have to evolve with it. That's why I think really speaks to that evolution. That evolution speaks to the need for this new tool, which is SSPM.
Yeah. Fantastic. I totally agree with you on that. And Aaron, on that point, like if we look at that top data point, the SaaS to SaaS connections, we know this is a study that we conducted some time ago where it showed that within 6 months, over half of those connections are inactive, but they retain sensitive read-write permissions. Can you just talk us through, give us, how a simple app-to-app integration can compromise the security? You already kind of alluded to that in your previous point, but these many gateways into being compromised via SaaS.
Yeah, absolutely. I think supply chain risk is kind of coming of age at the moment, right? Seeing a lot of big compromises in the industry as a direct result of these kind of SaaS to SaaS connections, whether that is these kind of dormant lane connections with sensitive access or actively used, whatever it may be. I think it's something that's really kind of coming to fruition at the moment. And I think the first thing to kind of talk about is the types of integrations, right? That can likely exist, of which I've typically found within big SaaS products, there's two. Okay, so your first would be these OAuth based connections, and these are the more kind of simple primitive connections and ways for other SaaS applications to kind of integrate into the organization's platform. And risk number one with these is typically they leverage the same level of access as the user that is approving or accessing your platform, right? They have the same level of privilege. And people may say, okay, well, how about scopes, OAuth scopes? They can be used to kind of minimize that level of access. And that is true in theory that they could. However, if you take a look at some of the largest SaaS platforms today, these scopes are generally quite vague, right? They don't necessarily look at individual granular access. That is left to the permissions of the connecting user, this integration account. They more look at things like, can a user through this OAuth application access the REST APIs or the SOAP APIs? Can it be used offline? And things like that, right? So you really have to focus on that integrating user and the permissions that they have. Okay, so these breaches are largely as a result of not employing the principle of least privilege and only granting these SaaS to SaaS connections, these integrations, the minimum level of privilege necessary to perform its function. We all know it's much easier to just say grant full access as opposed to granularly going down the list. But if you look at GitHub today, as an example, when you're even selecting privileges, they're removing the ability to just select all because they know that people are more inclined to overprivilege these users. Secondly, with these applications, they can circumvent your organization's security posture that applies to other forms of authentication, right? Like just standard login procedures, etc. For example, in certain cases, in certain platforms, connecting through an OAuth application, you have the ability to circumvent any IP address access control, right? Which is a huge mitigation for a threat actor. They can circumvent those. In addition, how are these applications authorized in the first place, and who is authorizing them? Can any user self-authorize themselves to use this third-party application that's granting access to a third party to your system's data? And so those points with respect to OAuth are things that organizations need to be asking themselves with respect to each and every one of these apps, right? And then briefly in the second point, the second type of common form of integration is a form of package. Okay, so these are much more complex. In Salesforce, you've got managed, unmanaged packages. ServiceNow, you've got updates, etc. You've got these bundles of custom components that a third party is delivering to you and asking you to install, right? Could be for enhanced functionality, custom functionality that's being introduced to your system. And there's some very, very good points to bring up here. That is one, who is reviewing the components within these packages? What is actually entailed within these components? Have they gone under security review by a vendor, right? So biggest SaaS vendors Salesforce, ServiceNow, for example, organizations can apply for their package to be undergone a security review by the Salesforce or ServiceNow security team. So ask yourself the first question: has this undergone an approved process, right? Secondly, unlike OAuth-based applications, they can introduce code level risks. Okay, so Salesforce, Apex code, and these can introduce their own types of code level vulnerabilities, right? Socket injection, running with unlimited privileges. And then last, in addition to that, are they introducing their own custom permission sets with that and asking you to apply these to the user they're integrating with, right? So what privileges are they asking for? So once again, principle of least privilege here. So that's kind of what makes these vectors, these third-party risk vectors, so dangerous, is because unlike other types of vectors where a threat actor is looking inside from outside, trying to kind of exfiltrate bits of data, once they have established a connection or compromised one of these third-party connections, they already have some form of foothold. So it's up to your organization to minimize that risk if it does occur by employing least privilege and those kind of things I talked about.
Yeah, that's fantastic insight. And I think, you've given us that detailed perspective for one SaaS app or SaaS instance that you're using. Now you multiply that complexity across the organization, and I think you can get an understanding of just how difficult it is to manually try and manage this in a proactive manner. We're not into taking into account the number of updates, etc., from the SaaS vendors themselves. So it just becomes a impossible task to manually address. Moving on, I know we're coming up close on time, but moving on to we've already kind of touched on some of these aspects throughout the conversation. Aaron's point on the fundamentals, identity and access controls. Aaron, just you've kind of touched on that last set there. Just to talk us through the identity and permission sets, from an identity security perspective, and why that is such an important element of securing your SaaS.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last point, I kind of briefly discussed this kind of privileged foothold, right, granted to these third-party applications. But with respect to this topic, I'm going to talk primarily about an unauthenticated perspective, right, where a threat actor does not have an account or some form of connection to get inside your platform. Okay, so with respect to an unauthenticated external threat, the biggest risk is going to be the level of access granted to this unauthenticated user's profile. So I say profile. What I mean is that most SaaS platforms have a way to represent every unauthenticated person in the backend as this single entity. Okay, and every unauthenticated user is acting with these individuals' permissions. And the risk here is nearly always data exfiltration. So this can be through existing out-of-the-box APIs that exist on the platform that they're attempting to query for data, or they could be APIs that have been developed by your organization or a third-party organization that exist on your platform and provide some form of functionality, right? Like retrieving and submitting a ticket. And I think at the least, organizations need to prioritize regularly auditing the privileges of this unauthenticated perspective, okay, to see what they can access. And one thing that I can't stress enough to organizations is that it is always best to assume in one form or another that this data that they have permission to look at is there for everyone to see. This illusion of, well, they can't see it in the UI, it's not a defense in depth approach, right? These external interfaces can exist that can be queried. Secondly, second most importance is kind of auditing any exposed custom developed code introduced as an exposed kind of public API. And this is something that organizations will struggle quite a lot with when it comes to manually auditing this kind of custom developed code, right? It can be very time consuming, but they should always go into review. And in addition to that, they should always employ DevSecOps kind of best practices and principles with how that kind of code is deployed and where it's deployed initially. And another massive thing to note is monitoring and detection, right, and alerting. So understanding audit logs that are available to you as a customer of a SaaS platform, understanding the maturity of these logs. It's one thing to say, yeah, well, we ingest these logs in our SIEM, like Splunk, we ingest them, and they're rolling on in. It's one thing to say that, but it's another to make them digestible information. Enrichment and normalizations are a huge part of this, right? Because you've got multiple SaaS products, multiple different sources of logs, all in different formats, and making all of that readable in a common format is something that is not as prioritized as much as it should be. And those can majorly reduce your response time if there's an incident, right? But naturally, you're going to be limited to kind of the provider's log maturity in that case. So don't be afraid to send in feature requests when it comes to protecting your business's data. And yeah, those are kind of the most important points with respect to kind of permission sets and also what to look out for past that in terms of auditing and monitoring, code level security as well, and who has access to that. And also at the base of all of it, principle of least privilege.
Yeah, fantastic insights there, Aaron. I really like how you unpacked that and the importance of log normalization. I think that's just the disparate nature of these SaaS apps that it's, you need some dedicated tooling to address that. Alec, take us through, there's been recently in the news, we know that there were the data leakage exposure incidents for Salesforce were found in Salesforce customer environments. The importance of these basics. If we look at the shared responsibility matrix up on there, just give us your perspective on, Aaron's contribution on focusing on that very detailed level of controlling your SaaS app instances, ensuring all of these best practices are implemented. Why are we still seeing such a wide sort of variance across organizations, across SaaS apps as well? I think that's something that we haven't really talked about today. I know we're tight on time, but not every SaaS app lends itself to being configured and controlled in a way that is equivalent to maybe industry best practices.
Yeah, just to keep it tight, because I know we're short on time. I'd start with a shared responsibility model. Again, if you don't know what your responsibility for, it's hard for you or your team to be successful for actually doing it. So really, thinking if you understand that, think again, right? Like it's worth doubling down your effort there to make sure you truly understand what you're responsible for. I think just the scale of the issue makes it almost an untenable situation for most enterprises. Aaron spoke to it earlier. SaaS applications, if you're only using 100 SaaS applications, you're in the very small minority. Majority are using hundreds of SaaS applications, whether they know it or not, right? Like if they're tracking, you got 150, you probably got 250. The challenge becomes again at scale, because not only dealing with a large number of applications, each one of these applications behaves very differently. And if you think you're an expert in one application, you're an expert in Salesforce, you're an expert in something smaller like Smartsheets or something. Even if those applications are very similar in functionality, the behavior is often very, very different. The permissioning model is very different. It may have little defaults that you don't pay attention to, because why would you? They're just defaults that end up exposing sensitive data publicly. Aaron's done a tremendous amount of research around this, has found some very, very interesting misconfigurations that most folks just don't even understand they're there. Until somebody who's really dug into the weeds like Aaron has understood. So shared responsibility, scale of the issue, the heterogeneous nature of the problem, and also the fact that it's constantly changing. So the app that you're looking at today may change tomorrow. You may not notice any difference, but that change in default may be exposing you. Aaron, anything to add?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. We'll end on that note. Thank you both for joining me today in today's discussion. And if you'd like to learn more, please reach out to appomni.com. I don't know if we have any questions, Alec, Aaron, if you can do a quick check on if we had any questions coming through. We can always follow up with those questions after the webinar. I know we're a little tight on time, but thank you for joining today's webinar. And like I say, find out more information at appomni.com. We'll be happy to help you. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.